I had to change, I got my dive certification last year, and I had to switch up from going like this to going like this. Because when you're diving, this means go up, whereas this means A-OK. So I like try to beat that habit out of myself, like, oh, no, like this. So good morning, everyone. I just want to first say that I'm a local, if you didn't know. I live in Pasadena. This is Pasadena City Hall. Pasadena is also the home of the Rose Bowl, the Rose Parade, Caltech, and technically JPL. JPL is actually mostly in La Cañada, Flint Ridge, but they maintain a Pasadena address for branding purposes, I think. So I'm really happy to be out here today supporting the local Los Angeles Ruby community. My name is Michael Hartl, and I'm here to talk to you about learn enough tutorial writing to be dangerous. I'm guessing some of you know me as the author of the Ruby on Rails tutorial. Just to get a quick sense of it, how many people here have read the Rails tutorial or have done so? Okay, so most people here know the Rails tutorial. Cool. Some of you may also know me for something else that's also, it's instructive. It is actually designed as a tutorial. It has a different tone. It's called the Tau Manifesto. I know we've got Ryan. I know Ryan back there is a Tau. Any other Taoists in the audience? Yes, all right. So this is an anti-pi mathematical essay. I'm actually working on some more tutorials now. This is the talk you're seeing today is a meta talk about a brand called Learn Enough to be Dangerous. This is actually inspired by Zed Shah's Learn Code the Hard Way brand, and it's meta, and it also manages expectations. You can't do Learn Python the hard way and then complain that it was hard. Similarly, you can't do a Learn Enough to be Dangerous tutorial and then complain that it didn't cover everything about it. And in fact, the first one is a command line tutorial, which would actually serve as a good prerequisite for the talk that we just saw. Coincidentally, it also uses, as one of the examples of a text file, a list of all of Shakespeare's sonnets. So that fits in with the talk that's after this one. It's totally coincidental. I don't think they designed, I mean, certainly they didn't know that I make frequent reference to the sonnets. But this actually just launched last week, the final version of it, and it's part of a series of Learn Enough tutorials that are designed as the prerequisites to the Rails tutorial. So a lot of people ask me if the Rails tutorial is good for complete beginners, and the answer is not really. It's not really designed for that. It's a little too hard. But people use it that way anyway, and in the entrepreneur game, that's called a proxy for demand, which means people actually want this, and so I'm making it. And so we started off with command line, and then it's going to go through text editor, and literally assuming the text editor, the command line tutorial assumes no background except for the ability to open an application. I'm going to get rid of the feedback there. Yes, so it's actually aimed at complete beginners. All of this happens under the general umbrella of a company that I've co-founded with a couple of friends called Softcover. It's a publishing platform for technical authors. It powers the Rails tutorial, the Tau Manifesto, and these Learn Enough tutorials. And the reason I mention this now specifically is because I'm working with one of my co-founders on the HTML and CSS tutorials. And in order to get started with that, I wanted him to know what I do when I write tutorials. What is my process? So I wrote a meta tutorial, Learn Enough tutorial writing to be dangerous, and that's the foundation for the talk that I'm giving today. And this is available online. This is actually, I'll mention a link at the end of the talk. So my approach to tutorials is grounded in something that's very old in human history. It is, I think not everyone takes this approach to tutorials, which is part of the reason I'm giving this talk. I hope this might be helpful to those of you who need to produce instructional materials. So everything I do is rooted in story. It's rooted in narrative. So the medium I mainly work in is long-form technical narrative. This is an ancient Greek piece of pottery depicting anyone know what this is from? Can you recognize it? Yes, this is a scene from the Odyssey. This is when Odysseus has his crew chain, or like a rope him, tie him to the mast. He wants to listen to the sirens, and what they do is they lure you, and so this is the way he won't be lured to his death, but he can hear them sing. And so human beings have been learning and retaining information through stories for millennia, at least, probably millions of years, probably as soon as we had language. And so in order to talk about the way I sort of build up a story, I want to first talk about some general principles for constructing a good technical narrative, and then talk about a specific process of successive refinement for actually making tutorials. And then I'm going to tell you some miscellaneous tricks of the trade. We'll start off with one of them, one of my favorites, which is to drop in something like this. This is an adorable baby anteater, and it makes me happy just to look at that little sleevey. Look at that little guy. I'll mention later on where that comes from. So we'll start off with these general principles. There are some overarching themes that come from the general way of making stories, and generally, so structure is the most general of them. So structure is essentially what goes where when. What do you cover, and like what is the order? And structure is maybe the hardest thing to master, because if you do it right, it's completely invisible. As someone reading a tutorial, you would never know that the structure is good. It just feels like things are flowing, and everything kind of sort of fits. And so I'll be giving you some principles that will help kind of hack the creation of good structure. And one of them is motivation. That doesn't mean your motivation as a writer or the motivation of the student. What that means is the motivation of the material. It's like, why are you doing what you're covering? At every moment, you should always know why you're covering that. But of course, that also does give rise to better motivation on the part of the student and on the part of the author. So one of the most general pieces of advice I can give you when writing tutorials is to defer material if you can. It's a very common newbie mistake, just to kind of throw everything in and be kind of comprehensive in the treatment. That's appropriate for a reference work, but that's not good for an instructive tutorial. So let me give you an example. You don't have to be able to see the details here. I'll zoom in as necessary. But this is the implementation of the sign-up form in the Rails tutorial in the case where the sign-up fails. So this is an invalid submission. At this point, if you've made these sorts of sign-up forms, you probably know that the way you handle the submission in Rails is using what's called strong parameters. But that is not necessary at this point in the tutorial. And if you've never studied Rails before, you don't know what strong parameters are. So if it can be deferred, it should be deferred. And so I've got a note here. It says not the final implementation as a comment. But then there's a reference forward. So there's a reference to the future section, and then that section identifies the actual subject, and in this case, strong parameters. So this is the concrete example of deferring something to the future. So it's tempting just to say, oh, well, let's cover everything at once, because that's how you might actually develop it in real life. But you're likely to overwhelm the student that way. And of course, later on, when you get to the strong parameters, it's nice to be able to make a back reference and say, remember where we came from? So that's the code listing. And I'll show you the actual code for producing this sort of cross-reference. This is actually the main reason that my co-founders and I built Softcover, is that it supports this kind of typesetting and then makes it really easy to deploy. So the way I write tutorials requires this sort of stitching things together. Another general principle is to focus on concrete examples first. Human beings are really good at generalizing from examples. It's tempting to start with abstract examples first, but it's actually a lot easier to build up to abstraction through concrete examples like this one. So here's a concrete example. Another concrete example. So rather than explaining to people the abstract idea of concrete, you can show them some literal concrete examples. We saw in the previous talk an example of the man page. And is the speaker still here, or did he take off back to San Diego? No, I think he took off. So he mentioned that you can use man on man, and that's a kind of fun. I have a slide in the. It's like a man on man kind of it's a basketball slide. It's kind of fun. So I love Man, though. Man is a great example, because check this out. This is the Man page for LS. Man is not designed to instruct. It's designed as reference. So look at this thing. Yeah, totally. Like, that's what LS is. But of course, in real life, like, what does LS usually look like? Right? Like, that's what it looks like a lot of the time. So here's this is a concrete example, and then you build up from that. LS-L, the long form of LS. LS-A, all, shows the dot files. And this is a useful one, LS-RTL. This is reverse time long form, so that the most recently modified files or directories appear at the bottom of the listing. This is a little suggestive, though. If you look at the A and then the RTL, this is actually how I discovered the -H flag. And my favorite Unix command, ls-Hartl. So -H is a human readable. So instead of a long string of how many bytes it is, it'll say like 3.2 gigabytes or whatever. So when constructing concrete examples, it's important to make them just the right level of difficulty so that you can induce in the reader a sense of flow. So flow is a concept in psychology where you are completely immersed in the moment and you almost lose track of time. It's being totally engrossed. So one of the fields that, one of the activities that induces flow is rock climbing. So when you're charting a rock climbing course, you want to figure out like, what's your path. If it's too easy, it's boring. If it's too hard, it's frustrating. So you want to be right on that edge. And so this is what I call the Goldilocks principle. You want your examples to be just right. You want to strike a balance between being too hard and too difficult. In order to do that, one of the things you want to do is try to imagine yourself in the mind of the reader and ask yourself, what do we know at this point in the exposition? Another really underrated general principle is repetition. A lot of people think, oh, I've already covered that. I don't want to cover it again. But if you show examples over and over again, people will generalize from them, and it will reinforce those ideas. Right? This is why you show LS, and then maybe another variation on that theme. This actually has known as the spiral method, where you cover the same idea through a series of increasingly difficult examples. But the repetition is absolutely valuable from the perspective of the learner. Do not be afraid to repeat material. It's great when you're just starting out to reinforce it. We forget that because we learn these things. If you ever see it, children will sometimes watch something over and over again. It's because they're learning new things every time. So don't underestimate the power of repetition. So now we want to talk about the actual process that I use. This is a process of successive refinement, and this is the process that gets you from the terror of the empty text editor to something like this, to the Ruby on Rails tutorial, which is a 700-page book. One of the things you need to do when you're writing really anything, but certainly when you're writing a narrative tutorial, is to get over it's a potential barrier. In physics and chemistry, it's known as an activation energy. You want to just get over. If you can get over it, then you can. Once you get started, it's almost like if you can just get started, then you can get rolling and get into flow as a writer and make the thing you want to make. But getting over that potential barrier is quite challenging sometimes. And so in this context, I like to invoke a principle that I learned about. I've adapted this. It's from an essay by Paul Graham, where he talks about his obsession with comb-overs. He has an interest in the phenomenon of a comb-over. And the question that Paul asks in his essay is, how does this happen? How does someone not see that this looks like what this looks like? And the answer is that it happens so gradually that they don't notice. The power of gradualness. And this is something I want to emphasize when and this applies not just to tutorial writing or writing generally, but almost any big project, is that if you just do a little bit, you just keep at it, just keep pushing in the same direction, it's amazing how much you can do. So the power of gradualness is not to be underestimated. Obviously, I'm not an advocate of an actual comb-over, as you can see. But the comb-over principle is a valuable one. So I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about this 5 steps to actually making one of these tutorials. So we start off with a free association step. And so I'll give you an example of what it might look like if you were writing say a section on Ruby data structures. So this is what a free association might look like if I were said, I want to teach people about Ruby data structures. I'm just going to just type out, what is this subject about? Okay, well, numbers, strings, arrays, hashes. These are some important data structures. This is actually, probably the easiest step of these 5 steps, just kind of getting it out of your head. The second hardest step is this one, what I call the content throwdown. So after you sort of block out, like what is the subject basically about, then you need to go from something like this, say let's expand hashes and say, okay, well, what is this going to start to look like? So at the content throwdown stage, the hashes might look like this. So at the top, we've got like a section. I've got a section name, and then this is a label, so I can refer to it. And then there's just some blocking out of like what this is going to look like, but you'll notice it's not even a full sentence. Like very common in web frameworks like Snot and Rails, we'll use frequently. Not even a complete sentence. So this is just almost a note to self. This is what this is going to be about. Notice I'm keeping motivation in mind. Why do you care about hashes? Well, if you're learning Ruby, the chances are pretty good you're interested in writing web apps. This is why you need to know about hashes. And then at this stage, I might say, okay, well, let's start with an empty hash. That's, again, just sort of a note to my future self. At this stage, you should defer everything you can. If you think, this is too much trouble, don't do it. You've got to get over that potential barrier. At this stage, just kind of throw down the stuff that, like, what is this going to look like when I actually get to it? And then here I've got an example, maybe an IRB session of what, like a concrete example of how to use a hash. So of course, I would do this for the whole free association, free associate the whole thing, and then go through like a second pass and start to kind of flesh it out. The third step is the hardest step in my experience, the main exposition. This is where you actually try to explain what it is that you're teaching. So for example, here's the hashes content throwdown, and we want to expand, start with empty hash to something like this. So recall from a previous listing that we can write an empty Ruby array as etc. So this is where I'm actually trying to explain what is a hash. This is where I put in things like these cross-references. This is a ref that gets automatically converted to something like listing 2.3 or whatever. That's the Softcover system is designed to support those sorts of cross-references. So that's like really kind of its reason for one of its main reasons for existing. So here at this stage, I start putting in the cross-references, and that code is what produces this sort of thing. And the way I work when I make these sorts of tutorial documents, whether they're sort of article level things like the Learn Enough command line to be dangerous, or a full book like the Rails tutorial, is I put in lots of references. It's great for the students, great for the readers, because they can click around and say, oh, what was that section? Or it's also a promise for the future. It's like, oh, yeah, the author's really going to cover this because I can see there's a reference. It's also great as an author to put in a broken reference as a reminder that you actually want to cover it. And so I find if you do this right, the cross-references are like a rug that just ties the tutorial together. After the main exposition, which as I mentioned before, this is the bone-crushing, awful step. It's just like, it can take days and days and days. It's just so much work. Then comes a series of polishing passes. And this is my favorite step. This can absorb a huge amount of time, but I really enjoy this step. I love going through and just like taking something like this. Oh, I've got an IRB session here, but this is important enough. I'm going to promote this from just an inline code sample to an actual code listing. So this is where now I can refer to it. This is important enough, I've decided on the polishing pass, that I'm actually going to refer to this using a listing reference. And then, of course, this is the actual code listing. So that's what produces this sort of thing, listing 7.16, and then a reference back up to the code listing. So the polishing passes often happen 2-3 times before I'm ready to show this to the world. But that is I put it as a separate step because it's so important. It's a separate skill to learn how to ship, just actually getting something out into the world. It's really important to do this as soon as is reasonable, because if you may consider yourself an artist, but real artists ship. You've got to get yourself out there. One of the things that I like to do with the things I make is first to release an HTML version I did this with the Ruby on Rails tutorial with one chapter at a time. I did it with the Learn Enough Command Line to Be Dangerous tutorial. It was great. I got a bunch of feedback. You can kind of outsource your technical editing, your copy editing to your readership. It's great. And my publication system is so fast. Like I'll just, someone will send me an email. I'll make a correction, deploy the fix, and send them the email back saying, thanks, it's fixed. So this is a great way to get started, to get out there. I'm not taking people's money yet, so like I don't feel so bad if it's not all that polished. I always call this a draft just to manage expectations, even if it's been through a couple or 3 polishing passes. So we go from, once you've gotten this out there, then you have to promote it. So this is beyond the scope of this talk, but I'll have a comment about this step. This is where it really helps to have a following. So you want to promote this out through Twitter or submit it to Hacker News. Don't rely on Hacker News, though, because you never know if you'll get upvoted. Right? You could just get lost in the newest page. I have a news feed, maybe you have a blog, something like that. Then probably the most valuable distribution or announcement channel is an email list. So at this stage, I announce things, get feedback, and then go through some more polishing passes. And then you have to remember, you're not done yet. Real artists ship. And then there's another shipping event, which is, in this case, I might have the sales. Softcover is an ebook production system and also a sales and marketing platform for digital products. And so this is the Ruby on Rails tutorial runs on Softcover. So this is where I've got the book, and you can also get screencasts in my case. But so this is the case where it's like, now it's out there, and now I've got to re-promote it, maybe on Twitter, Hacker News, my news feed, and the email list. So this is the process. Free association, content throwdown, which is painful. Main exposition, even more painful. Then one or more polishing passes, and then shipping, and then maybe iterating on the polishing passes and shipping again. At the end of this, depending on the situation, if it's something as big as the Rails tutorial, at least my experience is you're ready for a break. So I recommend at this point to maybe head off to French Polynesia. You're going to need it. You're going to need the break. So this is one of the things that happens if you ship successfully. So finally, I want to end with some tricks of the trade, just some very specific things that I like to include in tutorials I make. One is it's good to have lots of figures. Of course, you should have screenshots of things, but people love having something visual to complement the text. But I also like dropping in something like this adorable baby anteater. This kind of breaks up the exposition. It resets your attention span. I learned about this trick from Giles Boquet, so some of you here may know him. The Head First series was a pioneer of this approach to sort of use like the specifics of human neurology to hack the learning process. And so the idea is to show people something cute or something edible or something dangerous to reset their attention. So you might get something like this. I don't know if this counts as edible or as dangerous, but probably both. It's amazing, as a reader, it's fun to see these things, but as an author, it's a lot of fun. Like I'll see the baby anteater or whatever the things. I crack myself up. I'll see some of the pictures I put in. Yeah, that's boy, I feel better just working on this now. So it's amazing how much of an effect this can have on you, even as an author. I also this is a very specific thing. I love putting tables in. This is like tables of data. You don't have to worry about the details of this, but the idea is that you take the narrative exposition that you've made, where you kind of build things up carefully and maybe you cover stuff at different stages, you've deferred material, but then you can collect everything at once. So you might have this sequence spread throughout the tutorial, but then you can put them all together, and the Learn Enough Command Line to Be Dangerous product at the end of every section has a table summarizing everything. So you can get the benefits of the reference work while also having an instructive narrative tutorial that's good to learn from. And finally, there's something. This is a little fuzzy, but it's really important as an author to develop a voice. And I have some recommendations on how to develop your voice for tutorials. So voice really means the tone, the vocabulary, just the style that you use. when you teach people things through a tutorial. Now, this can depend on the kind of a document you're making. So for example, the Tau Manifesto is a polemic. It's an attack on the number pi, because pi is wrong. And so it has an edge to it, but it's still basically instructive in its tone. And the Ruby on Rails tutorial certainly is very friendly and tries to maintain an even tone. And the same thing with the Learn Enough brand. One of the nice things about maintaining an even instructional tone is that you can drop in something like an adorable baby anteater or a reference to the Big Lebowski, and the contrast with the evenness of the rest of the tone gives rise to some dry humor. So it's a way of getting some laughs by having this contrast in tone. One really common newbie mistake when making tutorials is to try that all the time, to try to always be funny, always keeping it like light and humorous. But the thing is, when you're learning something difficult, you're going to run into lots of problems. And it can be really frustrating when the author is like always making light of things. You're like, oh, I'm trying to learn this hard subject, and you keep making jokes. So it's really easy to overdo it. You want to have a lightness of touch. So we've talked about general principles, the process of successive refinement, and some tricks of the trade. We've learned that we have to obey Steve Jobs' dictum, real artists ship. So what happens? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we making this tutorial? Well, if you're lucky, you'll get things like this. You'll get a tweet, someone saying, almost done with the tutorial, and it's one of the best guides I've seen. It's obvious how much work has gone into writing it. So it's really satisfying, making something that teaches someone a difficult subject, a valuable subject, and having them actually say, hey, I really appreciate this. It's an incredibly gratifying thing to have that sort of impact on people. If you're really lucky, you'll get something like this. This came up a couple years ago. Someone asked on the question and answer site Quora, what is Jimmy Wales' favorite book? Jimmy Wales is, as you probably know, is the founder of Wikipedia. And it turns out that Jimmy Wales himself frequents the site and wrote, it changes often. At the moment, it's Ruby on Rails tutorial by Michael Hartl. So I'm like, yeah, that's really awesome. Like, I made something that Jimmy Wales likes. That's really sweet. And if you're really, really lucky, you can get this and make a product business that actually pays the bills and maybe can send you, when you're done with the 3rd edition, to French Polynesia, which I really need to say I needed that break. I've been working like nonstop for 6 months at that point. And boy, it was really nice to unwind. It's a nice place. This is Moorea. I took this picture my very self, and I definitely recommend French Polynesia if you can get out there. As I mentioned at the opening of this talk, this is part of learnenough.com, which is initially a series of prerequisite tutorials, but I'm interested in making other tutorials under that brand name. And that was the motivation for writing this original Learn Enough tutorial, Writing to be Dangerous, and of course, which is the foundation of this talk. So if you go to learnenough.com, you can see a link to this. And if you're interested in maybe writing a tutorial, maybe working with me on a more advanced tutorial on some subject, please let me know. Go to learnenough.com. You can find the contact information there. Or just please come up to me after this talk if you're interested in discussing what we might be able to do together. I'd really like to thank LA Rubyconf for having me out here today. It's been a real pleasure being a part of the LA Ruby community. Thanks. Yeah, we should have time for a few questions, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, it's getting even more meta. What's my advice for organizing conference talks? That's a good question. I think a lot of the same principles apply. In this case, I had a document that I was sort of converted into a talk. I feel like I'm not, like, as long as things flow into each other, I think you're in good shape. Like, it's almost more important in a conference talk just to make sure your slides have big fonts. Right, it's a good question. So the question is related to blog posts versus like long form tutorials. So I think some of these principles still apply. I mean, you always want to keep in mind what does your audience know. A lot of these problems don't arise though in shorter blog posts. And in fact, I actually am planning to start making shorter. I'm not calling it a blog. I hate the expectation that I make stuff on a regular basis. But just under my main website, which is at michaelhartl.com, also mhartl.com, both the same thing. I am going to start making shorter posts. But I've never really gotten, I think I know how to do it now, but I've never really gotten into blogging. And it took a while for me to realize that my natural medium is the long form narrative. So I would say some of these considerations do apply to blog posts, but they really are, I think, optimized for something that's longer. Just to give you a sense that learn enough command line to be dangerous is as short as I could make it and like still make it accessible and cover up through grep, basically, with no regular expressions. There's going to be a separate learn enough regular expressions to be dangerous. It's going to take all the regular expression stuff and suck it into one place. So it's basically everything, which you think that's not advanced at all. That's the point. It's very much a beginner. That's almost an 80-page PDF. So that's pretty long, right? It's way longer than a blog post. One of the nice things about that, though, is that if you get good at that, it's a barrier to entry, because most people have a lot of difficulty making things longer than a blog post. So I would say that you can get away with ignoring almost all these principles for a blog post, but if it starts to get even a little longer than that, then these principles are probably useful and applicable. So do we have time for one more question? Or two? Yeah. So the question is, if Jimmy Wells's favorite book is the Rails tutorial, or it was at that time, what's my favorite book? Oh man, my favorite. I mean, well, I will mention a book. We're going to go with like the stealing people's slides. I will say one of my favorite books in the computer programming technical world is Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, which we saw. It's usually called SICP. And actually, that's a good example of long-form technical narrative. People sometimes say, "Wow, your chapters are long." People will write these books where they'll have like 40 chapters. Like, no, please forgive me if you write books like that, but like that's just not the normal practice for chapters. SICP is this thick. It is 5 chapters, right? They're big chapters, but they are masterful at managing the complexity, at deferring material that they have to, at making good sections and subsections. And the material is amazing. Like I've read the whole thing. I've done the first 3 chapters, which is like the first 3/5 of the book. And so that's a great book to study. People will kind of roll their eyes if they did it as freshmen or something, like, that's for noobs. Or no, it's too hard for freshmen. But if it's a great book to really understand what computing is all about. And I think maybe one last question. The question is, how did I pick Rails instead of Django? He said I could have just picked Django, and I could not have just picked Django because I've been using Rails since before Django. So actually, my first startup out of grad, so I went to Caltech for grad school in physics, and after I finished my PhD, I decided to go the complete opposite route and become an entrepreneur. And my first company was actually, I hacked together my own like half-baked Python web framework. But so I was acutely aware of the lack of something like Django. So I started with Rails because it solved all the pain points that I had experienced as a web developer. But I would say if you're interested in producing something for an audience, like you want to kind of have a diversified portfolio. I think I was talking with the guy I'm working with now on some Learn Enough stuff, and it's good to make something that has an established market, but also look out for things like Elixir or Go that are taking on. It's hard to be too. I'll say it's hard to be too late to the party. Rails is still outside of this room. Rails is still like cutting edge for a lot of people. Like, well, we're thinking Rails looks promising, but it might be a little too edgy. So try to find something that produce things on established technologies and things that just interest you because they're on the edge. So that's how I got involved in Rails. It's like it was cool, it was new, it solved my pain points. And it takes a while. Like the Rails tutorial was my second Rails book. So it might take a while to get to French Polynesia, but if you keep at it. Oh, and I should mention, it's hard. You should build an audience before you launch something, but if you are interested in working with me on a Learn Enough thing, then you get access to my audience. So that's kind of a way of bootstrapping yourself as a creator of information products and narrative tutorials. So, wait, one more question? All right, come up to me after the thing. So, we done?
I think so.
Great, thank you very much.